The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
Get ready to navigate the American family tree because Assignment Discovery is tracing history in American Beginnings.
First, we'll watch scientists uncover the truth about a 9,000-year-old skeleton and its relationship with America's history in The Mystery of the First Americans.
Then we'll look at the influences on American government in From the Old World to the New.
Next, we'll see what it was like to live on one of the earliest English settlements in Jamestown, the first colony.
Then we'll learn why the Pilgrims really left Europe and what happened when they reached the New World in The Truth About Plymouth Rock.
Finally, we'll follow American colonists as they prepare to separate themselves from British rule in A Nation is Born.
America, from the beginning, coming up next.
As you watch the first half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
How can new evidence shed light on established scientific beliefs?
What influenced the founders of American government?
The discovery of a 9,000-year-old skeleton in Kennewick, Washington may tell scientists more about the earliest inhabitants of the Americas.
How did your family arrive in America?
My family arrived in America in 1992. We came from Nigeria.
My great-grandparents on my dad's side came here when they were in Turkey. They were Greeks living in Turkey, and they were being oppressed by the government.
Around the turn of the century, my father's family came from Italy, and my mom's family came from Poland.
My dad's family came from Russia, right before the Bolshevik Revolution.
My family from Poland moved here to escape anti-Semitism.
My mother's family came from Czechoslovakia.
My parents came 20 years ago from Taiwan.
My great-grandparents came to America. They are from Hungary, and they came over on a ship and went to Ellis Island.
Two young men took a shortcut along the Columbia River. Here, near Kennewick, Washington, they stumbled on a discovery that would rewrite the history books and launch a 3-year legal battle.
I saw what I thought was a rock. The top of it, what I saw was pretty round. And then after I picked it up, obviously, I saw the teeth. I wasn't sure if by holding this I was getting like pieces of rotting meat or whatnot. We couldn't see. It was kind of... We were kind of holding, I didn't want to touch the under part of it.
I thought for sure it had to have been some kind of drowning or murder victim from at least, a year or two.
Little did they know this skull would take us thousands of years back in time. The discovery of the skull led local police to launch an investigation. It might have been a body unaccounted for, a suicide, or an unsolved murder. It's not unusual to find Native American skeletons washed up from traditional burial grounds. Until police knew for sure, they treated this as a crime scene.
So we're going to go in and see if there's any bones, and it may be just going by feel and feeling to see what we can find.
The The river was murky, and visibility was poor. They hit bottom and worked their way forward, going by feel. Soon they were working on their knees. Buried in the muck were pieces of the skeleton. They left them in place so they wouldn't disturb the crime scene. In the meantime, the coroner brought the skull to forensic anthropologist James Chatters.
This is a first glance, so I don't have a sense of time on him. All I have is just his physical features to work with. The bone was in very good condition, good and sound, and didn't show a lot of weathering or dissolution or anything, so it appeared to be relatively young because of that. Very long, narrow brain case, fairly distinct brow, and a nose that just jumps off his face. Very pronounced nose. These are all characteristics more often see on Western Eurasian skeletons, European skeletons.
The skull appeared European, not Native American, and showed signs of being a few hundred years old. Jim Chatters believed they had found the skull of an early 19th century settler. The police called off the criminal investigation, and Chatters collected the bones.
What you're more relying on at first is visibility. Of course, then the water gets muddy and you start reaching down in and feeling around the surface for objects that don't have the right texture to be rocks.
Chatters couldn't fathom the importance of this discovery. It would turn out to be unique. The first clue was in the pelvis.
What you can see from the pelvis when we found it is it has a very narrow notch behind the socket for the thigh bone, and that narrow notch is indicative of a male.
Chatters came to call this male Kennewick Man. During 10 trips, he collected more than 350 bone fragments, about 70% of the skeleton. Only the smaller bones remained missing. Chatters let the bones speak. He estimated Kennewick Man's age at around 45 years old. He measured the femur, a bone that can indicate a person's height. The 470 millimeters translated to 5 feet 8 inches.
The diameter of the ball joint varies in proportion to weight. So you take the measurement. Kennewick Man's was 49 millimeters across this measurement, and that corresponds to a weight of approximately 160 pounds.
As he looked at the bones closely, he found signs of an extremely rough and difficult life.
Kennewick Man had been injured extensively. Among the injuries was a fracture in his ribs right through the center of his chest. Broke the ribs away right across both sides of his sternum, and some of them never healed back together, so they kind of caved in and out when he breathed.
Then Chatters saw something strange embedded in the pelvis. Chatters took the pelvis to Kennewick General Hospital for a standard X-ray. The X-ray would show if the object embedded in the pelvis was made of metal, like a bullet or knife blade. But whatever is lodged in the bone did not show up in X-rays. It was not metal. The mystery deepens. He tried a CAT scan next. The CAT scan took images of the pelvis from different angles, revealing anything from stone to plastic.
Let's see what we got.
Jim Chatters got the surprise of his life. Buried in what he assumed was a 19th century settler, he finds a prehistoric spear point.
Okay. And this base of the point here, sharp, clear, serrated or saw-toothed edge that's characteristic of what we call a cascade point, which is a style that was most commonly used between 5,000 and 9,000 years ago.
The spear point, cutting through bone and muscle, left Kennewick Man in lifelong pain.
The indications in the bone are that the spear point didn't kill him outright. It healed for a long time, and ultimately the body walled off that spear point. It left a pocket of infection completely isolated from the body that whipped pus off the back of his hip. We're moving toward the posterior side here, it looks like, so the fossa is...
Chatters was baffled. What is a 19th century settler doing with a Stone Age spear point in his hip? Jim Chatters sent a small bone for radiocarbon dating, hoping to solve the mystery of Kennewick Man. A chemist crushed the bone and began the process of analyzing an isotope called carbon-14. All living organisms contain carbon-14, and at death, it begins to decay at a steady rate. By measuring how much carbon-14 is left, the lab could determine the age. The results showed that Kennewick Man is more than 9,000 years old. He is one of the oldest and most complete skeletons ever found in America. And yet, he is a puzzle. Scientists have long believed that the first North American inhabitants were Native Americans. But Kennewick Man doesn't look like any Native American.
Well, the best way to characterize this is that for most of my career of more than 30 years, I had been following in the tracks of someone, and I thought I knew who I was following. And then finally, with Kennewick Man, I caught up with him, and he turned around, and he wasn't who I expected him to be.
The traditional theory of the peopling of the Americas begins during the last ice age, when a land bridge opens up between Siberia and Alaska. A group of people leave Asia, walk across the land bridge, and settle the Americas. It was long thought that these people were the ancestors of today's Native Americans. Kennewick Man could overturn this long-held scientific belief. But this hastily made video is the last Jim Chatters ever sees of his unusual discovery. "4 days after the radiocarbon date, government agents confiscated the skeleton. All scientific work stopped as 5 Native American tribes claimed the 9,000-year-old skeleton as their ancestor.
When the coroner came to get the bones, actually he called me and says, "Hey buddy, I gotta come get the bones." And I just virtually panicked. I felt that I had not had time yet and really wasn't equipped to gather all the information that collect a skeleton of this import required. So I felt I'd failed posterity. It was a pretty tough time.
Native American burials are one of the most controversial issues in archaeology. It's a controversy that goes back to 1868, when the Surgeon General ordered the U.S. Army to collect Native American skulls. At the time, it was to study the latest theories linking racial superiority to skull shape.
And basically, the United States Army did, for a long while, routinely collect Indian heads. I mean, they were something that they just went out, if you got a dead Indian, collect a skull, it's worth a few bucks. Send it back. There's a bounty on it.
Over the next 150 years, scientific theories changed, but collecting skeletons continued, deeply offending the Native American respect for the dead.
And I've seen Native Americans physically sick just at the thought of experiencing human burials. The Native Americans have strong religious beliefs about graves, and burials, and human remains. And it's a strength of feeling that most just can't understand.
By 1990, as many as 200,000 Native American skeletons were in U.S. collections. In response, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Under this law, tribes can claim any skeleton over 500 years old as their ancestor, including Kennewick Man. They have not just a legal claim, but a scientific one. For here, where Kennewick Man once roamed, researchers have traced an archaeological history back thousands of years, to a time before humans may have differentiated into the races we see today. To many scientists, 9,000 years of evolution could transform Kennewick Man's descendants into today's Native Americans. Local tribes plan to honor their respect for the dead and rebury their ancestor.
Under the federal law, if it's Native American, then we go into repatriation with our kind of responsibility that they have to make sure that this individual is laid to rest and can make his journey back to his reward. That's what the Indian people are interested in.
What's going to happen to the skeleton if it's turned over to the tribes? It'll go in the ground. It'll go in the ground it didn't come out of. What that means very quickly is it will deteriorate and it will disappear. What happens in the next generation when 15 or 20 new methods come up that allow us to ask additional questions? We won't have that material then.
The federal government began taking the legal steps to repatriate Kennewick Man. But then, 8 anthropologists sued. They claimed local tribes could not trace their ancestry directly to Kennewick Man, even using modern DNA analysis.
No one alive today can identify ancestors in the form of individual skeletons 9,000 years ago.
Richard Jantz is a skull expert and a leader of the Kennewick Man lawsuit. Jantz has examined most of the prehistoric skulls found in the Americas, those 8,000 years or older. With each skull, he took more than 70 different measurements and compared them to his database of 4,000 skulls from around the world. Just like Kennewick Man, most of the oldest skulls look nothing like Native Americans today.
They tend to be more similar to Old World populations, such as Polynesians or Japanese or South Asians, or in some cases even Europeans. So the picture that develops from the early crania is a complex one and one that we don't fully understand.
Jantz's radical theory is that none of these prehistoric skulls are Native Americans. He believes Native Americans migrated from Asia years later. Instead, the ancient skulls may represent 3 or even more earlier immigrant groups. Based on Jansen's analysis of the skulls, one immigrant group resembles people from the Pacific, like the Ainu. Though they now live in Japan, the Ainu are the vestige of an Ice Age population and may have originated from the same ancestors as the Europeans. They have thick beards, wavy hair, and round eyes. These people may share their ancestry with Kennewick Man. But if Kennewick Man is from the Pacific, he may not represent just a new immigrant group, but a revolutionary new way of coming to America.
What we're finding is that the early people look more like the Pacific Rim populations, like the Ainu of Japan and the Polynesians, and may have been derived from the same population that those people came from. If that's the case, then instead of coming through the interior, there's a good possibility they came around the coastal rim. To do that, they would have had to have boats because there's a lot of glacial ice in the way.
A startling new theory arises. The Bering Land Bridge might not have been the only path to America. It's possible that before modern navigation, a prehistoric group of people may have used small skin boats to skirt the Ice Age glaciers and settle the shoreline of North America. But what happened to all the different immigrant groups? The answer may lie in Kennewick Man's hip. Perhaps they were driven out in a violent conflict. Native Americans may not have been the first settlers, but the survivors. Kennewick Man raised startling questions, but Jim Chatters was left with only one way to study him. Working with sculptor Tom McClelland, he's making a cast of Kennewick Man's skull. What emerges is an almost exact reproduction. Now they try to bring Kennewick Man back to life. Using clues from the skull, they reconstructed what he may have looked like 9,000 years ago. Chatters began by adding 32 markers to indicate how thick the muscles should be. The markers are based on studies from cadavers and CT scans. Soon, he noticed a clue. Kennewick Man held an expression so tightly and so often, it has been ground into his skull.
Well, the muscles attach to the bone's surface, and as they're used over and over again for decades, they build up a little bit of a bony spur. The muscles that he's used most heavily are showing up here, here, and right up there. And they're the ones that pull up the corner of the mouth this way and the point of the chin like that. So this is what you do when you're just enduring something very unpleasant.
For a muscle, to kind of get a rough shape of it.
They constructed the muscles of the face and carefully placed them in position. In this case, they did not add much fat. Kennewick Man was in ill health and probably had a lean face.
We've added more than 20 of the major muscles of the face, the ones that give it most of its expression. We've also added the massive muscles of the neck. And as you can see, it already begins to take on the form of a human being.
Next, they added the skin, covering all the muscles. And they aged him. They added the years of living with the pain of a crushed chest and a spear point embedded in his hip.
Reality, sometimes I have to go back and work him down.
Really, he probably was pretty rough.
They added the effects of the harsh, dry environment, the creases and lines as the aging skin becomes less resilient.
Because of the harshness of the environment, because of the pain, this individual tended to age quite a bit faster than we tend to do in modern culture today. So we figured that this fellow would probably look something like, say, a rancher that worked outside a lot, maybe at the age of his late 50s, maybe.
After 9,000 years, Kennewick Man emerged. Was he Native American, European, or something else?
And then I finally just sort of went like this and turned him toward me and was just so close that I was face to face, and I was struck by how very strongly human he was. It's a reminder that Kennewick Man was a human being, and he had his own desires, his own likes and dislikes, and his own obvious difficulties with his fellow human beings. And in those ways, he was very much like the rest of us.
The legal battle over Kennewick Man continues. Scientists want to study one of the most precious finds in the Americas, while Native Americans have a religious and legal right to rebury their ancestors. No matter what the legal outcome, Kennewick Man is already rewriting the history of settlers in America. This land, it seems, was always home to immigrants. Did you know, even though any bones found in North America older than 500 years are legally considered Native American, tribes must prove that they have some relationship to the bones. Tribes are still in this process with Kennewick Man.
Democracies and republics have been around for thousands of years. America's forefathers used these time-honored practices to create a new government that would last throughout time.
How do past experiences affect decisions you make now?
I'd say that past experiences, they've given me a lot of background about choices I make now, and they're very important. I usually take them into consideration when I'm going to make a major decision.
I've learned from past really bad experiences to be more grateful for what I have.
If you make a mistake, you learn from that mistake.
Especially in sports in school, I play sport and you learn from the stuff that you don't do well.
I once stole cookies from the cookie jar. My parents got mad, so now I learned to listen to my parents.
For more than 200 years, Americans have enjoyed freedom under a government formed of leaders they chose. But where did American ideas of government come from? The earliest influences on American government stretch back more than 2,000 years to the ancient world. Judaism, the religion of the ancient Hebrews, and Christianity taught the principles of justice, morality, and the equality of all people. The government of Athens in ancient Greece was a direct democracy, with a large portion of all citizens making decisions. Ancient Rome set up a republic in which citizens chose representatives who governed on their behalf. The next influence on American government arose in England during the Middle Ages. In 1215, a document known as the Magna Carta placed restrictions on an English king's power and rights to tax the people. In 1689, King William and Queen Mary of England signed the English Bill of Rights. The bill made the monarchs rule alongside Parliament and prevented rulers from interfering with elections or freedom of speech. These ideas, justice, equality, democracy, republics, and citizens' rights, came to the Americas during the time known as the Age of Exploration. In the late 1400s, European rulers hoped to open new trade routes to Asia so they could profit even more from trade with that region. They sent explorers on ships to find new sea routes to Asia. Christopher Columbus believed that sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean would provide a quick route to Asia. He had no idea that two huge continents lay on the other side of the Atlantic. Sailing for Spain, he left Europe in August of 1492 in command of 3 small ships. But instead of reaching Asia, Columbus reached the Bahamas, which he claimed for Spain. Soon, Europeans realized that Columbus had not reached Asia, and they began to talk about his discovery of a new world. Within a few decades, Spain controlled an empire that stretched from Mexico through most of South America. Spanish settlers enslaved Africans and brought them to the Americas to work on plantations. As demand for slave labor grew, a new trade network connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. In a period of more than 3 centuries, an estimated 10 million Africans were transported to the Americas. Seeing Spain grow rich from American colonies, France, the Netherlands, and England sought their own colonies. As trade increased, capitalism took shape in Europe. In this economic system, people put money into a business to make a profit. Capitalism led to more exploration. Investors formed companies to equip sea voyages or to start colonies. Colonies played an important role in an economic system called mercantilism. They were a source of cheap raw materials, and they provided a market for goods made in the parent country, increasing its wealth. England had 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. 2 of them helped contribute to American government. Colonists in Jamestown and Plymouth set up elected governments. England's 13 colonies were split into 3 sections: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. The economies and societies of the 3 sections differed, but the colonies had one thing in common. Many people resented English laws that limited their rights to trade. Those objections would lead to conflict with the mother country.
Did you know? Christopher Columbus never believed he landed in the Americas. Even after his 4th voyage, he claimed that the islands he reached were part of Asia. Explorer Amerigo Vespucci concluded the land Columbus found was the New World.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
How can new evidence shed light on established scientific beliefs?
What influenced the founders of American government?
If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.
As you watch the second half of this program, keep these questions in mind.
Would the settlers of Jamestown and Plymouth have survived without Native Americans?
Why did colonists become upset about British taxes?
Jamestown was England's first colony in the New World. The group of people living there faced many hardships early on. But they learned to make use of natural resources and borrow from native people until their community could thrive on its own.
How do you face challenges and obstacles?
I think of an order of goals about how to get done. I see what the first obtainable goal could be, a short-term goal, and then I go from there and make choices depending upon the outcome of those goals.
When I face obstacles, I like to turn to my parents or other adults that I trust that can give me good advice on things.
I face obstacles and challenges with hard work and determination.
I'm in the process of overcoming getting rejected to almost every college I've actively applied to. So I think laughing at it and putting on a strong face helps a lot.
I guess you just face it head on and try and get through it. And then if it doesn't work out, you look back on it and laugh later.
In the early 1600s, England was competing with Spain to colonize the New World. While Spain concentrated on exploring the area from Mexico to the south, England looked farther north to Virginia. The English founded a new settlement, which they called Jamestown, after their king, James I. The settlers were financed by the Virginia Company, a private group of investors looking to make money from riches in the New World. The English settlers brought their culture, ideas, and tools to this unfamiliar new land. Among the settlers was 27-year-old John Smith. On May 21, 1607, Smith and some other men from the settlement set out to explore the nearby river. As the settlers explored, they also traded with different Native American groups. From these contacts, they learned of the powerful Native American leader named Powhatan, a man who would become very important to the settlers' business dealings with the Native Americans. Smith and Powhatan agreed on a trading partnership. Native Americans would supply the settlers with corn in return for copper, tools, and beads. In January of 1608, Smith returned to the settlement to report on his alliance with the Indians. But he learned that more than half of the settlers had died of sickness and starvation during the many months he had been gone. Smith was accused of causing the deaths of the two men who had also been on the expedition. He was tried and condemned to death. However, before he was hanged, a boat full of settlers arrived. The new arrivals shifted the balance of power in Smith's favor. They had all charges against Smith dropped. He was elected president of the colony 9 months later. Within months, Smith's leadership paid off. He set strict rules, strengthened defenses, and encouraged farming. While Smith was sleeping one night, his own supply of gunpowder accidentally exploded. He was so badly wounded that he stepped down as leader and returned home to England. Smith's departure and a harsh winter sent a chill through the remaining settlers of Jamestown. Relations with Powhatan's people grew icier as well. The winter of 1609 and 1610 in Jamestown is known as the Starving Time. The settlers were reduced to eating their dogs and horses. The cats were next to go, leaving the rats. The settlers also fell victim to an even more relentless enemy, drought. The settlement had become a death camp. Fortunately for the settlers, a fleet of ships arrived from England with more men and supplies. The ships also brought a strong new leader, Lord Delaware, who was able to keep the feuding settlers in line. The drought ended, and the rainfall nurtured a cash crop of tobacco that ensured Jamestown's survival. Within a few years, Jamestown grew to a thriving settlement, its population over 1,000. On July 30th, 1619, a meeting was called in Jamestown's church. Settlers formed an assembly to make laws for the colony. They called it the House of Burgesses, and it marked the beginning of representative government in the English colonies. Now settlers could elect officials who could make laws to ensure the smooth running of the colony. Many historians see this as the birth of American democracy.
Did you know? Stories about John Smith have romanticized his relationship with Pocahontas, one of Powhatan's daughters. In reality, Pocahontas was only about 10 years old when Smith met her. She later married a settler by the name of John Rolfe.
Everyone knows the story of the Pilgrims and their brave journey in the Mayflower across the Atlantic. We learned that they landed on Plymouth Rock and later feasted with the Native Americans. But how much of this well-known story is fact and how much is fiction? We are about to find out.
What do you know about the Pilgrims?
What I know about the Pilgrims is that they came here from England in order to find religious freedom.
So they came aboard the Mayflower and they headed towards the United States.
The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, which is in Massachusetts today.
Eventually they settled in Jamestown and then Massachusetts and other eastern colonies.
The soil and everything was foreign to them, so the Indians helped them farm.
I know that they had some problems with the Indians, like some of them didn't like them, and they were really strict about what clothes to wear and what to do, and like there was like not a lot of fun.
Know what your teacher forgot to tell you about the bad old Puritans? About pilgrims and log cabins? And pilgrims and religious freedom? And what about good old Plymouth Rock? Oh, well, you don't know.
In 1620, a hearty band of pilgrims left behind the tyranny and oppression of a distant place in search of liberty in a new world. They landed on Plymouth Rock and then built a log cabin community based on the principle that all men should be free to practice their religion any way they choose.
Okay, I know that's how we all heard it, but none of it's true. The Pilgrims didn't land on Plymouth Rock. They didn't land in Plymouth at first to begin with anyway. They didn't live in log cabins. They didn't go around wearing those funny black outfits and kooky hats. We've been had. To get to the bottom of this Pilgrim scam, we decided to start with Plymouth Rock.
And what is this? What is this, John? It's the first rock.
Well, you know, I wish I could actually touch it so I could say I touched the rock.
If you're patriotic, you appreciate it.
The first thing you notice about Plymouth Rock is that it's surrounded by a huge Greek-like temple. Look at this thing. It's made out of Quincy granite or something. Anyway, under any other circumstances, this would seem ridiculous. A rock surrounded by its own temple. But of course, this is Plymouth Rock. It's to the Americans what the Eiffel Tower is to the French, what the Leaning Tower of Pisa is to the Italians. It's our sacred national shrine. It's America. Indeed, the rock is so important to us that pilgrims visit the place night and day, every night and day, 365 days a year. Even presidents visit. When they put up the temple in the 1920s, President Warren Harding came up from Washington to join in the celebration.
When I was a kid, there was no portico. The rock was just here.
The portico has been here since 1920. This was constructed.
Well, maybe it was
in
open then, but I remember walking on the rock.
Indeed, you might very well have, because there was more shoreline here, and there wasn't the railing here.
Yeah.
Look we have a bird on the rock.
And here's what all the fuss is about. Yes, this is it, Plymouth Rock.
We came all the way from Hollywood, Florida to see this rock, and it's not big enough.
But I can see why the Pilgrims landed here, because there's all this money around here. I'd stop here too.
They had to stop somewhere. You know, they're running out of water here. There's not too much further to go.
You know, you always hear stories, you think it's some kind of cliff, some kind of mountain, kind of like something really enormous. But you get here and, yep, it's just a rock.
There it is.
And that's just the beginning of the disappointment. It turns out we built this huge monument, this huge temple, to a rock that may be no more significant than any other old rock. I know the Park Service people here give you a different story.
A man in the bow spied a rock that jutted out into the sea.
But according to historian George Willison, who wrote this book, Saints and Strangers, back in 1945, and who spent his whole life studying the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock, the whole story is just malarkey. A folk story turned into a money-making tourist attraction. What Willison found out is that the Plymouth Rock legend rests almost entirely on the dubious testimony of a 95-year-old man who told the story more than a century after the Mayflower landed. The man was Elder Thomas Faunce, the year 1741, and it happened while Faunce was down on the beach with some friends.
My father told me the story about the old comers' arrival in the New World, and he told me they landed on this rock right here.
Well, you never told us this before.
You know, well, let's go.
Like most historians, James Baker agrees with Willison that it's all a myth.
Do you buy the story?
No, I think Elder Faunce is, well, what is Elder Faunce, when he's 95 years old, is carried down, he says that's where the forefathers landed. pointing at the rock. It might be a place, therefore, that was near there. That was a marker for his own mind. But they didn't specifically say, perhaps, they actually stepped on the rock. But that was a marker roughly where he said they landed. And of course, this is 121 years after the event.
Unfortunately, not too many people ever heard how we came by the story of Plymouth Rock. Willison's book came out at the end of World War II, and Americans had more in their minds then than pilgrims. Besides, it was a book, and people by and large don't read books. And so we've all gone merrily along repeating the same old story as if it's true when it's not. And of course, there's even more disappointment. This isn't even where the rock was located when the Pilgrims landed. It's been moved.
1620, Plymouth Rock.
Plymouth Rock looks like it's always been just where it is now. But townsfolk repeatedly moved it, initially to help inspire patriots on the eve of the Revolution. This is where things get comical. Over the years, the rock was moved so many times it started breaking into pieces. At one point, there were 2 Plymouth Rocks. The half that broke off on the beach, and the other half they'd moved into the center of town. Then they lost the half on the beach, until it turned up as a doorstep to an old warehouse. Eventually, of course, they decided to have just 1 Plymouth Rock because it was too confusing having 2, so they glued them together. It was a good repair job, but the rock still doesn't look the way it used to. It used to be bigger. As the rock became more and more famous, people started breaking off huge chunks for souvenirs. They've got a chunk of the rock in Plymouth Pilgrim Hall. Here it is. It's stashed in the basement, right next to the men's room. 200 miles away, we found another hunk of the rock at Vassar College. See that doorway? That's it right there. They just put a hunk of the rock up there. And then we found yet another chunk of the rock across the country, in Seattle of all places, embedded in this monument to the pioneers of the Northwest.
It's just one rock. Yep. It's just the one rock.
Yep.
And this is where the pilgrim, this is where it all started, is that it?
Just between you and me, I like the story of Plymouth Rock. To paraphrase Warren Harding, I love the story of Plymouth Rock, whether it's true or not. It's a great story.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I might want to jump in and hug it.
A lot of the things I've told you about today are unbelievable. I know that. It's because life is unbelievable. And as a good friend of mine likes to say, it's unbelievable because, well, people are crazy and do darn fool things. It's what makes history interesting. And that's no myth. I'm Rick Shankman.
Did you know? The Pilgrims learned from the problems the Jamestown settlers faced. They discovered that to establish a strong colony, they needed to form governing rules, so they created the Mayflower Compact and agreed to follow it firmly.
American colonists enjoyed their distance from Britain, although they still lived under British laws. After protests and riots failed to set them free, patriots decided to fight for independence.
What are the benefits of working as a group on a project?
People don't like to be lonely, so people eventually will always come together.
When you have a lot of diverse people, you have a lot of different ideas that you bring to the table that you wouldn't normally experience outside your own personal view of life.
If someone is from a different race or a different religious background, I can get how they feel towards the subject.
We're all Americans, we're all of the same race, and the fact that we can come together for the different motivations and the different values of our country.
The United Nations brings people together, and ideas can come in from all sorts of places.
Sometimes there's jobs that are just like a little bit too big to handle by yourself, and so you need the help and support of other people to help you out and push through things.
By the 1760s, those living in the 13 British colonies in America enjoyed the relative freedom of being governed from thousands of miles across the sea. 2 major movements shaped Americans' attitudes. One was the religious movement called the Great Awakening. It helped convince people that they had the right to decide how to govern themselves. The other was an intellectual movement called the Enlightenment. Thinkers like John Locke wrote about the rights that all people in society had. These movements set the stage for conflict with the British government. The immediate cause for the conflict was a series of laws that the British Parliament passed in the 1760s. These laws, which put new taxes on the colonies, angered the colonists. In 1765 came the first. The Stamp Act required every piece of paper, from pamphlets to playing cards, to display a revenue stamp. The Stamp Act set off riots and demonstrations, and the colonists stopped buying British goods. Parliament gave in and scrapped the stamp tax, but it passed other tax laws that led to more protests. In 1770, protests led to violence. On March 5th, a mob of Boston dock workers confronted 9 British soldiers. The soldiers fired at them and killed 5. Some colonists, who came to be called patriots, organized to protest British actions. They called this incident the Boston Massacre and used it to fuel anger against Britain. The patriots' next target was the British tax on tea. On the night of December 16, 1773, a band of rebels marched to Boston Harbor disguised as Mohawk Indians. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor in a protest that became known as the Boston Tea Party. Most colonists expected the troubles to blow over, but in Massachusetts, patriots prepared for war. On the night of April 18, 1775, some 700 British soldiers were sent to the small town of Concord to capture weapons held by colonial militia. Several dozen armed militiamen were waiting in the town of Lexington on the road to Concord. The British ordered them to leave, but a shot suddenly rang out. Both sides began firing. The battle was brief, but left 8 colonists dead and 10 more wounded. News of the British march spread to many nearby towns. Hundreds of angry militiamen gathered and fought the British at Concord and as they returned to Boston. The rebels used the surrounding woodland as cover and fired at the British from all sides. When the British finally reached Boston, nearly 250 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. Any hope of peacefully resolving the conflict between Britain and the colonies had vanished in a cloud of smoke. Representatives from the colonies gathered in Philadelphia in a meeting called the Second Continental Congress. They voted to create an army to fight the British. George Washington was named the Army's commander-in-chief. Despite the fighting, few colonists openly called for independence. Only 1/3 of the colonists were for the rebellion, another third were against it, and the remaining third were indifferent. But public opinion began to shift, helped in part by a pamphlet written by an Englishman named Thomas Paine. In Common Sense, Paine wrote that Britain's king had no right to rule America, and he urged the colonists to declare independence. Paine's powerful words persuaded many colonists to support independence. In June 1776, Congress named a 5-man committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, outlining the reasons for separating from Britain. Thomas Jefferson wrote the draft, which eloquently set forth the position of the American revolutionaries. On the 2nd of July, 1776, Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, it approved Jefferson's declaration. The Declaration rallied the Americans around a cause, independence. Achieving that goal took many years of war. Finally, though, in 1782, British and American representatives met in Paris. They negotiated a treaty that ended the war and recognized American independence. A new nation was born. Did you know? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after they signed the Declaration of Independence.
You've been given all the information. Now it's your turn to discuss the questions. Take a moment to talk about the following.
Would the settlers of Jamestown and Plymouth have survived without Native Americans?
Why did colonists become upset about British taxes?
We hope you've enjoyed this Assignment Discovery Journey into American Roots. If you'd like to learn more about what you've just seen, go online or check out these books at your local library.